There we go. How are we doing, everyone? My name is Sean Flannery. Today on the Total Basis podcast, joined by fellow co-host Felipe Malicio, and we're joined by a special guest today. Felipe, would you like to introduce our guest?
Sure, absolutely. It's Cory Richmond of the Work to Shoot podcast. Cory, go ahead and introduce yourselves, please.
Hey, it's Cory Richmond, one half of the Work Shoot Wrestling podcast. I do a wrestling podcast for over 200 terrible, most likely episodes with Jason Brooks over the last, on and off for the last 6 years, talking the good, the bad, and the ugly of professional wrestling, WWE, AEW now. If TNA or ROH or these other companies do something worth talking about, we will talk about it. But like I said, for the most part, it's WWE and AEW and New Japan Wrestling. But during this quarantine, we're doing maybe 2 episodes a week, but usually it's Thursday evenings on YouTube right now. But also you can find us on Anchor FM, and you can check us out on Twitter at WorkedShootPod, and my personal one is at Paladin808, which, as Jason, my co-host, usually says, nobody really cares. But
So in terms of Twitter handles, I'll always love Felipe's when he would plug it into our episodes, Pathological Hate, and it's a great Twitter handle. But wow, that's a lot of different wrestling that you guys cover. I mean, I haven't really watched wrestling since my younger years. What about you, Felipe? And you're still pretty into it?
Yeah, I just got back. Well, I stopped watching back in 2001 when WWE bought out WCW, and for me, that was like, all right, I'm done with this crap. I mean, because I knew that once WWE had like some sort of monopoly on the industry, I knew that it was gonna not be my cup of tea anymore. So I stopped, and I finally came back at around 2016.
Okay.
That's when I started watching regularly, and I've been watching since. But I don't know about you, Cory, man, but some of the stuff that's been going on, I'm ready to be lapsed again. That's the term that they use, is lapsed, when fans like me. I'm sorry, what was that?
The lapsed fan. Yeah.
Yeah, that's who I am, and that's obviously the other podcast I listen to regularly is the historical podcast. They do wrestling historical podcasts. But yeah, they call them laps, and we leave, and then we come back, and then. But like Cory mentioned, with so many wrestling promotions out there that are available just on television and on YouTube, there's more wrestling more than ever. So that's kind of keeping me kind of sane from leaving, because I do think that WWE just sucks for the most part. So yeah, I'm when Cory mentioned All Elite Wrestling and Ring of Honor and New Japan Pro Wrestling, my ears kind of perked up. Like, oh, okay, yeah, I'll listen to that.
And
I'll watch because I watch
some
them
new
more
stuff
than anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something out there for everyone, and
Absolutely.
that's what kind of got me back. I mean, I never really left because, unlike my partner Jason, he has more of a life. I guess you could say. I mean, he's got a wife. He has a wife. So I mean, he has more things to do. But I've always been a fan of wrestling, and it's the one thing that I love baseball, all sports, and a lot of different things. But wrestling is one of those things that always has got me back in. And the good, the bad, and the ugly, as I often say, it's one of those things that just keeps on bringing back in. As bad as it is, even when it's bad, there's some things that are so bad that it's just comical, and it's just one of those things that you could just make fun of, and you just sit there going, why am I watching this? And then you could just make fun of as you're watching it. But one of the things, I was watching your show last week, and I really appreciate you guys bringing me on, but Sean, I just got to ask this. I don't have a fight in this, but I understand as a Met fan, you have a loyalty to your guys.
Oh, super duper loyalty.
And as an Indians fan, I mean, I have guys who I've rooted for over the years that no business ever caring about. There's guys mostly people have never even heard of.
Yeah.
But how do you put Brandon Nimmo over Andrew Benintendi? and I mean, none of you guys had Benintendi. I know Benintendi was terrible last year. But just on the idea that, and I understand Benintendi had 140 strikeouts. So it was a huge amount over the year. Like maybe it was 114, and he had a ton more, and he was hurt a little bit last year.
Yeah.
And maybe there's the idea of potential, and Cespedes is never going to play. We understand that. Something will happen.
Hey, I agree with you on that one there.
But how do you take Benintendi over – I'm sorry, how do you not take Benintendi over Nimmo? I mean,
and I really do like Andrew Benintendi. I think he's going to be great value, and just in terms of, the perceived value, everyone's so down on him, when this time last year, everyone was hyping Andrew Benintendi. But I still see the underlying skill set. A lot of the issues with Benintendi that we've even seen when he's been successful has, like the advanced metrics, a lot of the batted ball data does not, really show that he could be something, crazy successful. And Brandon Nimmo, I mean, is kind of in the same boat, but he has a way different underlying skill set. And with the underlying skill set that Nimmo has, I talked about it. I'm a huge plate discipline guy. And Brandon Nimmo fills that, and that's the hill. I said I'm willing to die on it, and I'm glad you're calling me out on it because I love defending it. I love getting into a debate on Brandon Nimmo. I'm going to be 75 years old in a nursing home singing the praises of Brandon Nimmo.
And Benintendi is 2 years younger, right?
He is younger. Benintendi got up here fast. Nimmo did take a while. He was one of those Wyoming products, in the snow. They don't actually have high school baseball, so he is a little older, but so is Pete Alonso, and we still like him too. But to kind of tie it back into wrestling,
can I just intervene really quick?
Yeah.
For the record, Cory, you'll be glad to know that in my rankings, I have Andrew Benintendi ranked as a 28th outfielder on my list, and Nimmo is 48th overall. So it's all him.
It is all me.
He's the Mets homer.
That is the only guy I will homer for. I promise. He is the only one. I didn't even put Pete Alonso on my team. Come on now.
You did put Michael Conforto.
I understand that you guys are going to talk a little bit more wrestling because I'm on, but I could talk fantasy baseball all day long on that aspect. But I think Rizzo is a very interesting candidate this year in regards to batting first in that lineup and what happens with him. I think. Especially with the idea that I think the ball may not be as juiced as it's been in past years.
It'll be interesting for sure.
Alonso could be a guy who could be one of those guys who's even more important than the fact that guys may not hit as many home runs. The idea we don't know now the league has seen him more, how that batting average is going to be truly effective. And I don't know, some guys are playing in leagues that are on base and some are, batting average leagues. So, I mean, we'll see how that happens. But like I said, this is your guys' show. Let me not.
You are fine. We have you here to talk.
Shut up.
We have you to talk. Trust me, you are doing exactly what we wanted. So, Felipe, what was your defining moment? I'll ask both of you guys this, but when it comes to wrestling and baseball, What is the one defining thing in each that keeps you coming back? Because obviously you walked away from WWE, but you did come back. So, what is they don't have to be the same in each, but maybe they are. So what is it?
Yeah, well, obviously what keeps me coming back to baseball is the fact that I can intertwine both the fantasy aspect and the real aspect of it all. Also, for baseball, it's a little bit different for me as well because that's not just fantasy baseball, but even as a kid growing up in the 90s, I always wondered, and this is without me knowing about Bill James, I didn't know about baseball perspectives, and even as I got into my 20s, in college, I didn't even know about Fangraphs or any of those. Yeah. I just knew that deep down inside that there has to be a better way to gauge the way we evaluate players. And that's just with me not even reading a book about it. I didn't know anything about like these advanced metrics. I just know that there has to be some other way. There has to be a number that some other people have been creating that will do a better job of evaluating these baseball players so we can all like get a better sense of what it takes to be successful. And little did I know that while I'm questioning all these things, in another parallel universe, there's all these maniacs coming up with fielding independent pitching and weighted on base average and all these other metrics that we are now, we all use and we take for granted nowadays. But yeah, growing up, that's what kept on coming is this thirst for knowledge and this thirst for wanting more, just more baseball, more stats, more numbers. And then once I got into fantasy baseball, I mean, that just you're getting me involved in some weird way. You're getting me involved with these baseball players and these baseball teams where I have to pay attention every single season. So all of these factors intertwine. As far as wrestling goes, however, like I said, I stopped watching, but just watching on YouTube, just old clips of WWE, of what made me a fan of the WWE during the mid-90s, watching old clips of what I've been missing, watching old clips of other promotions, watching all these old clips. And the number one thing that got me curious around 2015 was watching. I just was curious about watching The Rock, Rocky, Dwayne The Rock Johnson, going on the microphone and just talking. And that's what sparked that. And that just led into a domino effect. Okay, well, that's The Rock. What about Stone Cold Steve Austin? What about CM Punk? What about all these wrestlers who are very good on the mic? And so they're good on the mic, but what do they do inside the ring? And it was a crash course of 16 years for me to get to where I got comfortable and admit that, hey, you know what? I can watch this again. I think it's safe to come back. And I've been back ever since for the last 3 or 4 seasons. I've done not as many as Cory, but I've done a few wrestling podcasts over the years, mostly with Jake Schwartz, who is the main host of the Podjobbers podcast on our Life Group podcast groups here. So, yeah. Oh, yeah, Henry. I just see Henry mentioning that he knows Cory Richmond. And, Cory, I knew I recognized you from somewhere. I just couldn't quite put my finger on it. You guys you're friends with Henry, right? Is that I'm gathering here?
Yeah, I've known Henry for a while.
How do you know him?
Through unfortunate means. No, I've known Henry through a bunch of friends who watched wrestling and played fantasy sports, I guess, and a couple other things. I guess I don't actually truly remember how I met Henry back in the day, but I've known Henry for, I guess, about 10 years now, I think.
I think that's the best way to say you know Henry is you forgot how you met him. That's probably best for all involved. Say you just don't remember the whole occurrence. It all ended.
Unfortunately, unfortunately for me, I have to always remember how I met Henry because it was pretty tumultuous how I got to meet the guy. He basically saved me from a situation. Not nothing dire, but just for Facebook terms, he saved me from a dire situation from beforehand, and I'll leave it at that. So Henry's a good. Yeah, he's laughing at us. Yeah, unfortunately, it is what it is. We are tethered to him for better or for worse. We're married to the guy, unfortunately, or fortunately.
Your Honor, I refuse to incriminate myself.
There you go. Plead the fifth. Yeah, for me, wrestling was one of those, no one, like my parents never really watched it, but just one day I was like, 8, 9 years old, just like sitting down watching TV. And then you see all like these ripped dudes and they're just throwing each other all over the place. The very nice looking girls come out and you're like, oh, this is fun to watch. This is entertaining. And then you start you'd come back the next week and then you started realizing all the overlapping story arcs and everything. And so it was very easy to get invested in as a younger kid. And I'll always remember just I think the 2 WrestleManias I watched, we just having WrestleMania. So I figured I'd bring it up a little bit, was 24 or 23, 24 and 25. The Shawn Michaels, Ric Flair, and 25 was Shawn Michaels losing versus The Undertaker. And I remember I was just enamored with it. And then I can't remember the exact time. I found their big secret, and I thought it was real, being the very much believer that I was. And I just lost the fire for it. Every now and then I'll see it on the TV and I'll watch it. But then I've realized that so much has happened, and I have a hard time, how would I catch up and getting back into the story arcs? But it's something I do want to try and get back into. So, Cory, with that being said, what would you pitch to me to get me back into watching WWE and wrestling?
Don't. No.
Save me. So thank you for saving me from myself.
No. I guess the idea is, I don't think you ever truly lose your love for wrestling and sports, which I think is very similar, where just like any fandom, you can go away from it, but if there's ever any sort of fandom that was there in the beginning, it'll be something that could always bring you back. There has to be one angle or one person that just brings you in. Like for Felipe, it was like The Rock. For certain people, it was when the whole entire thing when CM Punk became big, when he left, and there was a crossover with the sports world where you had people like Michelle Beadle found out about him, or what's going on here. You have a new guy in AEW named Orange Cassidy who's taking everybody by storm with this thing called Sloth Style, where this guy who apparently he just doesn't care, but he's just so relaxed at just what's going on here. People just all of it, the Young Bucks, who have basically from nowhere have made their own name in the business, where they had their own T-shirts and Hot Topic. Guys who've never been to WWE.
That's something else.
never been in WCW, which was the big company back in the late 90s into the early 2000s, which was bought by the WWF. Back in 2001. But there's always something that'll bring you to, like, just like with sports, with baseball can go on strike, but for some people, the idea of expanding the playoffs, that brings people back in. Or the idea of, bringing, with some of these weird ideas of, extra innings, which I think is the stupidest thing, putting somebody on second base, or some of these ideas, the idea of bringing people in with fantasy sports, or, the idea of, you can go to a baseball stadium, or a football stadium, and you can do live in betting now. Yeah. If there is, and maybe when it comes to betting, you just sit there and you go, all right, this guy's a degenerate gambler, and he's just there because it's just something to bet on. But there's something there that will bring you back. If there was something there, I'm not into Star Trek or Star Wars, but every time a new show comes out, you could say, I'm never watching this stuff again. I guess I'll screw these things up because I don't know the difference between one or the other. But I'm guessing I'm going to sound terrible. Star Trek and The Mandalorian, I don't know if that's the same thing with Star Wars.
It's not.
That made it so much better, though. That was perfect.
But I love this, though. Because I purposely combined the two just to piss off the fan bases. This is music to my ears, man.
I'm a Doctor Who person. So, we all have our thing. But the idea of, you could be super upset with the rise or fall of whatever name these movies were, but all of a sudden people love The Mandalorian, and you sit there and you go, you know what? I'm still upset with that, but I'm back in. This Baby Yoda, or whatever they call it, is like this. Apparently, it's like the cutest thing in the world. I'm in. Chris Jericho has this awesome song, Judas, and people are singing it. Every time it comes out, that becomes a phenomenon, and people are back in. It just takes one thing for you to get back in. So, like I said, I know I'm being a little long-winded here, and I know you guys don't care, but it's just the way.
No, you're good.
With the guilt that keeps on talking here. But I think that's just the way it works. If you find something that brings you back in, that will get you there, Sean. Maybe some people, the minute they hit puberty and they realize girls may actually like them, they're out. Other people, they find out, girls are super interesting, but not all of them are going to talk to them. They realize they get back to college and they're in a fraternity or whatever, and they start watching. They walk by someone's room and they see they're watching the pay-per-view. They sit down and they start watching. They're back in, and they realize, all right, this is kind of cool. People maybe watched ECW when it was a hardcore style stuff. Someone getting hit with, a steel chair, even though we know that's wrong. Like, all right, this is kind of cool. It's a different style. So, many different ways, Home runs, get people, what they say back in the day, chicks dig the long ball. That got people back into baseball. So,
the home run derby. Yeah. That was basically the conversation in Dong City. Sean, you'll be proud that in the 30 minutes that I listened to yesterday, no mention of Houston Astros, or not even that many mentions of the New York Yankees. So, but yeah, they mentioned how the home run derby, and I've been one of those that I don't care about the home run derby. I was there once they came back in ~95. I was watching. I would wait. I was like that dog from Futurama, just waiting forever for baseball to come, and they finally came, and I got back into it. Unbeknownst to me, that there were people that were kind of mad that they felt betrayed and they felt abandoned by the sport that they grew up loving. And it took maybe Cal Ripken breaking the Lou Gehrig record for more fans to come back. But I'll admit that '98 brought a bunch of people back because of Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa. So yeah, I guess there is some lapsedom in baseball fans as well, but I don't think it's as extreme, championship wrestling. No, as extreme as they are in wrestling, where you will have people like me go 16, 20 years without watching and paying attention to the sport.
Yeah, I might come back into it. I haven't pulled up on my screen right now. It's like I'm looking at the old Generation X, like when it was like Michaels and Triple H. Like that's what I loved when I was like super young. And then like I don't know, it evaporated for me. I guess that I kind of transferred into baseball. I stopped watching as much wrestling. I started watching more baseball, and which was a terrible time because back-to-back years, 2007, 2008, the Mets just completely blow it in like September. 2 straight seasons. 2009, everybody leaves or gets hurt. It was a tough time, but we're here for the long haul.
I've been meaning to ask. What's an Alabama boy like you rooting for the Mets? I never understood that. Did you ever explain this on the podcast here?
I've never explained it on the podcast, but I guess we can go a little historical here since this is a fun episode for us. But both of my parents were born and raised in New Brunswick, New Jersey, And
Oh.
by life and happenstance, they moved down to Alabama. My dad, he used to brag all the time about, he'd be an hour train ride from Philly, an hour train ride from New York, not even an hour train ride from Philly. And he'd go to all the games, go to Madison Square Garden, watch whoever was playing there, and then just hop on the train and go back home. And I'm like, and you raised me in Dothan, Alabama, that no one can even point out on a map? Like, that's just cruel that those are your life experiences and you just kept them from your own children. But yeah, that's how I ended up a sole Mets fan and Rutgers fan down here in Braves and Roll Tide country. So it is quite tough, but we power on. I mean, there was a little bit of time I was doing Uber, and I had a Rutgers hoodie on in Montgomery, Alabama, and this guy hops in the car, and he says, "Are you wearing a Rutgers hoodie?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "What are you doing in Alabama?" And I was like, "How do you know what Rutgers is?" He says, "I work there." And he had come down to play on the golf courses in Alabama that we're famous for. And I was just like, we both looked at each other and said, "What are we doing in Alabama?" That's the origin Mets story for me.
Congratulations on your top 50 prospect for Rutgers, apparently.
Oh, yeah. But for you, Cory, we talked a little bit before the show started. How long have you done fantasy baseball? Kind of delve into our actual topics here.
I'm guessing somewhere for the last maybe 15 years, I would guess.
Have you ever won?
More,
Have you ever won a season yet?
Yes.
How do you know how many?
2.
2. Okay, that's not bad. I think I started in depth fantasy baseball my freshman year of college, so about 5 years ago, and I've won once in 10 or 11 leagues. But I always finish top 3 teams. I just cannot get past it. I'm the Los Angeles Dodgers of fantasy baseball. Wait, I'm really good at getting into the top 3, but I can never win.
How many teams are involved in these leagues that you're finishing top?
Usually 10, 12. I had a couple of 15s in there when I first started.
All right, so I heard a 15. All right, I can respect a 15-team league. When you're telling me 10-team leagues, it's
yeah. I have a one league is a 30 team. I always talk about it with Felipe. It is a 30-team, 40-man rosters. It is.
Wow. All right, I can respect that.
It's tough, but it's fun, and hopefully one day we can have when baseball comes back, we can have a full episode just about that team if Felipe will let me. But
masochism is a thing here in this podcast, though.
With you, Cory, what is the one thing that brings you back to baseball and fantasy baseball in particular? Felipe told us what brought him back into wrestling and baseball. So what about you?
Well, I think the general idea is just wanting to is winning. I mean, everybody says, it's, the money aspect for a lot of people, but it's the idea of, especially when you're doing it with friends, the leagues that I don't do any leagues where I don't know people, because I know there are a lot of people who do all these leagues that for the competitive aspect of these big money leagues, but I do it for the competition. See, I was going to say this before, when it comes to sports and wrestling, which is a common idea, I was never good at sports or when it came to actual physical activities. I'm one of those people, I can talk about sports, but I'm not good at them. So, I mean, my dream, you may not know about this, and I don't know about either one. The biggest sports radio station in the country, I'm from New York, I live in the Bronx, is WFAN. When I was growing up, my dream was to work for WFAN. I wasn't, that didn't happen. I mean, I work in the media industry in my real life before the pandemic, but that's what I became good at. I became good at talking about everything. And so I went and learned everything I could about sports. And when I understood when I was in college, so God, maybe it's more than 15 years, I guess it's 20 years, because I'm a lot older than you guys. When you went and said, 5 years ago in college, I don't know if you saw me, my mouth opened up.
I missed it, no.
He's a youngin'. Yeah. I'm probably closer to your age than you are to Sean.
Yeah, I'm 42.
Never mind.
I'm old man walking over here, about to fall off the chair and be put in a home at this rate compared to you kids.
I really wish I had a soundboard and I was going to play Oklahoma State coach. I'm 40. I'm a man. I really wanted that soundbite when he said his age. That would have been fun.
Come after me! Go ahead.
But no, continue, Cory.
But so what was I saying? No, but the idea of just like I said, the competitive nature of beating your friends. I mean, as much as you love all your friends, nothing's better than, I think I was in a football league or definitely a baseball league with Henry. But, the idea of head-to-head beating Henry, which I think I mostly, at least on a week-to-week basis, maybe beat him at least once. Because I'm sure Henry thinks he's great at everything, which is true. But I'm sure in the chat he's going crazy right now. But just the idea of, being better at something than someone else. And, just because I can't do it on the actual field, doing it, with your brain, I guess, is good. I mean, I'm one of those still people who may be older, the eye test. I mean, when I'm doing fantasy baseball, I'm looking at what I see on the field more than sometimes the extra numbers. I mean, I look at, the WAR and all this stuff. I mean, I'm not as crazy as some people don't believe those things matter. But I still look at, what these guys do. I mean, I have the MLB package, which they have my money for right now, even though the games aren't existing, which I might be a little bit unnerved about, but that's another story. And I think it comes on maybe the same thing with wrestling, the idea of I couldn't go on a mat like, a Kurt Angle or any of these guys, but the idea of watching these guys doing something that I could never do fascinates me. The idea of, these guys talking and bringing somebody into a venue. Like, I think Hulk Hogan is the worst thing in the history of, when it comes to actual wrestling. But what he can do and talk to but there's two parts of wrestling. There's the talking, and then there's the in-ring. Some people love the talking aspect, like The Rock. He was never great in the ring. He got better. But what he did better than almost anybody else in the history of wrestling is getting you in there. Talk, the idea, and like, there's the two greatest overall people maybe are Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair. Hulk Hogan got you into the building. Ric Flair kept you in the building. Hulk Hogan got you to buy the pay-per-view, but when you bought the pay-per-view, you didn't turn it off because you saw a guy like Ric Flair, a ravishing Rick Rude. I'm trying to people maybe actually these guys might be too old for even you, Sean. Because
I remember Flair. I remember the tail end of Flair. The retirement match is I remember like.
I'm sorry.
Like the retirement match between him and Michaels. He ended up coming back afterwards for a couple of years, right? That was only like
TNA and gave up his soul for Lecture Bus for one of his 14 wives.
Yeah,
Alimony, apparently it's terrible.
Keep counting. But I do remember that one. That one, the Shawn Michaels and Ric Flair, the "I love you" right before the speech and music. Oh, I remember it like it was yesterday. I love that stuff. So maybe that is what I need. I need something like that. I need to see something like that in WWE for me to come back into it. I don't know.
You know what? I'm sorry, Felipe, to interrupt you here for 1 second, but I don't think WWE is what you would like. I think you should be watching on Wednesday nights on TNT. Trust me, TNT is not paying me by any stretch. Nobody's paying me. On TNT on Wednesdays, watching AEW, because it's a really good mix of the old school and the athleticism of the independent new school stuff, where you have guys like who are talking on the mics, like the Jake the Snake Roberts, who are going to bring you in there. But you also have the athleticism of the Young Bucks, who do all these fantastic moves. You have the Chris Jerichos, who may not be in, the greatest. He has the 50-year-old dad bod, as people want to say, but he'll talk you into there. But you have the campy stuff of a Matt Hardy, who's doing this Vanguard One and all the stuff that's like totally out there. So I mean, there is this mix of stuff that is going on that Sean, I think, you might like. It might be way too campy for you. So I don't know how much
this is news to me. I just looked it up. I'm definitely. I'd love to get into it and start watching it. I mean, that sounds interesting. I see like a promo picture, and I believe it's supposed to be Jericho in the middle, even though he looks a lot like Triple H. He looks like Triple H when he got old.
God, yeah.
That's what I'm seeing now. Is like with the hair, they look a lot alike. I remember Chris Jericho being the younger guy, and Triple H being the old guy. Now they're just morphing into the same person.
No, Jericho stopped taking the needles, and Triple H still takes them. So there's a difference right there. To piggyback off of Cory was saying that about Hulk Hogan, I'll admit it, and I admitted this in the inaugural Podjobbers podcast with our guy Brett Moore. I agree. Hulk Hogan was the reason I paid attention to the WWF back in the day. I was watching Suburban Commando nonstop when I was a kid, and I know there was The Nanny and all these other crappy ass movies, and that got me in. And during that early '90s stint, what got me to stay for better or for worse, was a guy like Bret Hart, who Jacob Anthony Moses mentioned him earlier in the comments section. So yeah, that's pretty interesting. I as much as I like to bash Hulk Hogan because I find him dull, and to me, I already mentioned that the in-ring stuff is what gets me going, because I still think it should be treated as a real sport, with the understanding that there's storylines and there's things that wrestlers got to do on the mic to get people interested. But yeah, I'll admit that Hulk Hogan got me in. But once I found out that there's more aspects to wrestling than just Hulk Hogan, I would learn to despise the guy. I hate him. I can't stand him. And the stories. And then, you know what, Sean? What makes it even more interesting is not just what goes on inside the ring, but the stories that go behind the scenes in between shows. Like, you haven't lived until you heard stories about Hulk Hogan backstage just being uberly paranoid about his standing. This is the top draw, mind you, right, of all time, and he's paranoid that someone's gonna is out there to get him and topple him. And
he's the Joe Exotic of WWE.
Oh my God, pretty much. This guy, because he's not a real fighter, he's not a real wrestler. He's always mindful that there are other better in-ring wrestlers out there who actually know something or a thing or two about putting you in a lock. This guy goes way out of his way to be very mindful. Like, oh man, this guy could pin me in so many ways, and there's no way for me to defend myself because all I am is muscle and no substance. So he's very mindful of his standing. So yeah, so that's another thing is, like, aside from the in-ring product and the television product, I think reading the stories that go on, like you mentioned, Degeneration X and all that, that you enjoyed watching, finding out the stuff that goes on behind the scenes, I think will lure you in as well. Which I want to ask you guys. Do you guys get that? I mean, Cory, I'll start with you. Do you get that aspect from any other sport besides wrestling, that sometimes the stuff that goes on behind the scenes is more interesting that goes on than what actually goes on in the rink or in the baseball field or on the football field, et cetera, et cetera?
If you don't mind, I'll take this one first. Absolutely. I think that's one of the reasons that I think sports radio is so big, especially like in New York and around the country. Like, especially like during this, not to bring the show down, but like during this pandemic that we're going through, you still have people talking about sports even though there's nothing going on, because like with football, baseball, off-season stuff is going on, 365 days a year now. I mean, you have people like on WFAN are talking about Chris Childs made comments about Charles Sprewell being, basically a phony and a fraud for, sitting at courtside to support James Dolan after the whole Charles Oakley situation. I don't know how much you followed that, Sean, being in the wonderful state of Alabama.
A little bit.
So I mean, behind the scenes stuff in sports is, on why certain people get hired or fired, with like the Rooney Rule when it comes to football, on why there is so few, black football coaches, or why certain guys get hired and fired. Why, like a guy like Joe Girardi was not hired for the Mets, even though he was more than likely the perfect candidate. I don't know what as a Met fan, if you wanted him or not, but I mean, I don't know if that's been
I was actually one of the few that didn't want him, but that's another discussion we can have.
But I think that's, the idea of behind, and that's one of the things that we talk about on the Work Shoot Wrestling podcast. I'm more than 2 times I'll say that. I'm sure I'm, as the publicity whore that I've become over the years. But that's one of the things that we talk about on the show quite a bit, is not just like the who wins or loses, because, really at the end of the day, who cares? It's just ideas of why that type of stuff happens. I think that's why, like with fantasy baseball and fantasy sports, that's one of the things I think that brings, besides the winning and losing, I think that's one of the most interesting things that is behind the scenes. Why people get brought up. If you're gonna draft a guy, when will a Joe Adell, I think his name is Adell?
Yeah, Joe Adell. Yeah.
Joe Adell. Are they gonna keep him in the minors until June, or when is he gonna come up because of his status with you getting an extra year of eligibility and stuff like that? So I mean, and the same idea. Are you gonna keep a guy in? This is a wrestling thing where NXT was the minor league system for the WWE. Now it's a quote unquote third brand, but how long do you keep a guy in their minor league system before you bring him up? Because if a guy's in NXT, he doesn't have to get paid as much guaranteed compared to the WWE if he's on the main, on the main show before, because NXT was just on their network, their streaming service, compared to being on the USA Network. So the behind the scenes stuff is, I think, it's sometimes more interesting than the actual, who wins or loses for guys and women who are in, spandex.
Yeah, that's actually the way he described it had me thinking that what WWE profits off most, is those storylines. The storylines are like, what keep the people invested. The product in the ring can always, change back and forth. While with, MLB, NBA, NHL, the product on the field is what they profit the most off of. And the storylines, I don't want to say they try and bury most storylines, but it's not in the advantage of the team or even sometimes the advantage of the players for there to be some, story off the field, because it's usually viewed as a distraction. But in wrestling, it's almost viewed as a absolute positive because of its ability to keep people invested. I feel like most professional sports, they don't need, some some like, rumor or some drama. Like drama is viewed usually in a negative sort of way with professional sports. You hear the coaches and the players say, "Oh, I'm just here to do my job." If they're asked some kind of drama-filled question from a reporter, they try and glance it off. But in wrestling, they handle it completely opposite, and it works.
I never saw it that way. Usually when they talk about why, like for example, if here in Chicago, Mr. Trubisky, why he's a failure at being the quarterback. Yeah, I saw that face. Nice, keep done.
I've been Baker Mayfield. I understand.
Oh, okay. Oh, wow. Well, I mean, my thing is, like, now you're starting to hear all these rumors and backstage, these locker room stories about how the coach doesn't really like the quarterback, but the general manager wants to kind of save his face because he's the guy who went out of his way to draft them. And to me, they're not. It's not like we don't treat it like Dave Meltzer, for example, the dean of wrestling journalism. And I'm going to get a lot of flack for calling him the dean of journalism because everybody hates Dave Meltzer. But when I don't know, I forgot who the main journalists are for the Chicago Bears beat writing team. But if it's like on the Chicago Tribune, for example, I just see it as a report, a legitimate report. That's just factual, near factual speculation. Yeah, we're pretty much. I don't consider it like a storyline, and I get annoyed when you see TV broadcasts and they're like, so what's the top 7 storylines for this game today? What are we looking for besides the actual strategy that these two teams are going to incorporate? I hate that, and it goes back to how I treat wrestling. I only care about the in-ring stuff. I only care about the results. Everything else is just a distraction. So maybe that's part of the problem with me in wrestling is I try to treat it too much like sports. But it's interesting how you made those parallels that these rumors, these speculation, these journalistic pieces that they do, that's backstage info. The way that I just explained how Hulk Hogan is paranoid. That's very interesting. I never saw it that way before.
Yeah, it's not just like, definitely in the off season of sports, we dive more into the storylines of the season. You look back at the previous season and you try and infer from how they played, how they acted, how they're going to do the next year, which to kind of tie it into fantasy is, we have to look into those off-season storylines. How many times do we hear, oh, he's arrived at spring training and he's in the best shape of his life? We probably hear that 50 times from 100 different players every single year. But as fantasy players, we have to dive and take some of that into account. Some of these guys, they actually are in the same shape they were the previous year, but they are maybe, they did yoga or Pilates and they're in a better headspace or something like that. But it's definitely like once the season starts, the professional sports and the professional athletes, they really don't want off the field, distractions. And that's, I guess, the best way to refer to them as is, like the storylines and such. They just want to go and kind of do their job.
Love him or hate him, there was a guy in wrestling named Eric Bischoff who was one of the main factors in the Monday Night Wars. He was the head booker at one point for WCW. He wrote a book called Controversy Creates Cash, and that's one of the main things. If you think about it, you can go 2 ways with this. Like when, in the off season, think about it like with arbitration. All year you're saying how great a player is, and then when it comes to arbitration, you're saying all the things that they do wrong. You could have my guy, Lindor. He's great in all of these things, but I'm sure that when he's asking, for like $18 million, and the club wants to pay him 14, because they're penny pitching, and our version of Dolan, was a big as moron as the Knicks one. All the teams I root for, don't know what the hell they're doing most of the time. At that point, you're saying, well, he could do this better, you could do this better, and I'm sure he went and dated this one person in high school who has screwed with his head forever. I mean, the idea of these storylines, I guess the difference is in wrestling, most of these storylines, most of the things that go on behind the scenes usually work into storylines down the line. So they say controversy creates cash. That's how you kind of look at it.
Yeah, I get that. Controversy and bad things usually tend to sell in the news. It's kind of I get it. That's why with some of the WWE storylines that I remember, like Gen X and the Hardy Brothers, it's kind of like they always had the feuds and whatnot in WWE, and it's like always the one thing that I remember is like the feuds being like the big thing that everybody talked about week to week is like how did this feud advance and how did this feud stall out or et cetera like that. Felipe, do you have any other questions for Cory?
Yeah, I mean, since I asked you how you became a Mets fan, I wanted to ask Cory, you mentioned that you're originally from the Bronx, but you're a Cleveland Indians fan. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, I misheard. But so did you transfer from Cleveland and transplant it to the Bronx, or how did you become an Indians fan?
All right, this is going to sound ridiculous, but
okay.
First game and this is all of my sports fandom is very similar. First game I ever went to was Yankees Indians back, I guess, like 86, 87, because like I said, I'm older than dirt compared to you youngins. Yankees, and like I said, some of the facts are most likely wrong, but Yankees were winning. I think it was like 4-3. Brooke Jacoby came up, hit a double, and I think it was like the 8th inning, top of the 8th, and we go from there.
Wow.
They won the game, and I was hooked. Favorite player growing up was Cory Snyder because partly because he had the same name as me. It was like kind of cool. You have Cory and Cory, and I didn't have that many people. Of course, besides the drug addict Corey Haim, Corey Feldman. Not exactly the greatest role models for
people named Cory.
Exactly. Because it's a unisex name. Great. Let's go that way. But same thing like football. First game I ever saw was the Jets and the Browns. Bernie Kosar, my favorite football player of all time. They won. Nick fan.
I'm sorry, which player? I'm sorry, I missed it. Which player?
Bernie Kosar.
Oh, okay.
It's scarred me ever since. The Knicks, Trent Tucker and all those teams with Ewing never started a championship. Only team I ever root for that's ever won anything is the New Jersey Devils. And fortunately, I live in New York with a bunch of Rangers and Islander fans, so that's always fun. We don't have enough people to even have a parade like in a parking lot. So
Henry is giving you some props right now, Cory, in the comments. He said, I'll give you credit for this. When the Browns left, all of his friends gave him a pass to root for the Ravens. He refused, held out until the Browns came back. So that's fandom right there. That is loyalty till the end. It's like if I had to go back and be a Mets fan for their first like 5 or 6 seasons, like how tough that must have been. I mean, granted, it was an expansion team, it was a new team, so it's kind of hard to be loyal and invested, but I imagine some of them were. Like that's tough. But
screw that. I'm adopting a different team if that's the case. If the Bears leave, I'm adopting I'm not waiting for them forever. We're not good enough. Our money's no longer good enough for you. Screw you guys. But I guess that's pretty admirable that you waited like.
That's also depends on how they left. I mean,
yeah.
Like I'm not a fan. Like I've never been to the Mistake by the Lake, so I've never seen the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I've only seen the Browns and the Indians play when they've gone to the Meadowlands or to Yankee or Met Stadium. Met Stadium, that's terrible. Citi Field or Shea Stadium. Yeah. So if Art Modell didn't leave in the middle of the night like a scumbag that he was, and sorry, the guy's dead, but screw him. My fault. I wouldn't be. If they would have moved and did this thing the right way, I would have most likely been a Baltimore Ravens fan if they did it the right way. But the way that they left, they screwed the fans, they screwed the people. So it's not like I'm born in Cleveland and I'm this and that, and no. It's the idea that I rooted for a team, and the team, and they kept all of the legacy and the history was with them, So, but whatever. I'm just like I said, it is what it is.
Oh man,
Henry saying it's tough even now. So,
Sean, I just got a quick question for
you.
Like, what type of stuff are you? Because like I said, I've only listened to the last episode, and I'm going to go back and try to hear some stuff. But like, what type of stuff do you like that maybe I can help you here? Like, find a type of wrestling that if you do give a chance, that maybe you actually might like.
Well, like I remember, it was a mix of I liked Shawn Michaels for very much the same reason. He had the same name. He spelled it differently, but Shawn Michaels was a guy that I really did like when I was, growing up watching wrestling. Mysterio was always. Yeah, Mysterio was always cool. The Jeff Hardy, the Hardy brothers, that was like, it was so much fun to watch. I think I kind of lean towards Felipe though, in like what they did in the ring kind of is what drew me to, what's the proper term for the word there? Drew me there. It's like just the way that their personality, not necessarily on the mic, but their personality in the ring was what I liked. Like Flair, I liked Ric Flair. He was interesting. I guess we can say that both in the ring and out of the ring. He's very interesting, according to his 14 wives. But it's just kind of like just something that's entertaining in the ring. Like they do something that's, I guess they all do something that's different. But like watching Rey Mysterio wrestle was way different than watching like the Big Show wrestle. Like that just felt like how it was two different ways, and yet they were still pretty successful at what they did.
You know what? I would say you would be someone who would most likely, if you were to try to get back in, I wouldn't watch the main WWE product of a Raw or a SmackDown. I would watch the two shows that are on Wednesday nights. NXT, which is their quote-unquote developmental system, which is less talking for the most part and more in-ring based, and AEW, which is a more of a combination of, you could say, maybe a little bit like the NWA, WCW, older like Mid-South type of thing, and then which having the independent style of like the fast-paced guys just doing not just crazy flips and dives, but just doing a more in-ring style. So I think if you wanted to try to get back in, I would try to do the Wednesday night stuff. But if you wanted to see just something that was totally crazy and make your head spin, you may not get all the references because you haven't watched lately.
Yeah.
And Felipe, I don't know if you had a chance to watch WrestleMania, but
I'm not watching
what'd you say?
I'm not watching WrestleMania. Fuck that.
The match between Cena and The Fiend, which was wasn't an actual match, but the Firefly Funhouse match was, I think, I've never done drugs in my life because I'm not cool apparently. You may, if you ever done them, it'd be one hell of a thing to watch. It wasn't wrestling, but it was entertaining. I'll at least say that to the company.
Is Bray Wyatt still in WWE?
He's a character now called The Fiend.
Oh, okay. So that is the guy.
Yeah.
My connection there is he went to Troy, where I also graduated from. Like that was the big thing when he became the WWE champion. It was like everyone's like, "Oh yeah, former Trojan," and then nobody really talks about him anymore.
The Fiend and Bray Wyatt, great entertainer, great on the mic, very boring in ring. So you have to sacrifice one for the other. I don't like I've already watched numerous Bray Wyatt Fiend matches. He is boring as hell to me. I fall asleep. Same thing with Randy Orton. If you saw me commenting about Dave Meltzer saying it's the worst match, and like I believe it. If it's Randy Orton involved, I believe it. He's dull as hell. So
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. You were saying?
I think Randy Orton is a terrific wrestler, but that match was 36 minutes long. The Last Man Standing Edge versus Randy Orton match. If the match was 15 minutes, 20 at 18, 20 minutes, it would have been a very good story, very good match. But when you can watch basically the longest other match on WrestleMania twice back to back, and it was basically equal to the amount of time of that last man standing match, you know there's a problem. When it's the second longest match in the history of WrestleMania, right behind Brett versus Sean, the 60 Minutes Iron Man match, you know there's a problem.
Oh man, you're bringing some memories back. Unbelievable. I'm getting hassled by my friends here. Jacob and Matthew Whelan are urging me to watch WrestleMania. I'm not watching it. I'm not watching Quarantine-mania. That's not what WrestleMania is. It's just, to me, it's like it's supposed to be bigger than life because that's how McMahon wants to do things. And you're an independent show now. So if I want to, and you don't even have that in-ring style that I like from independent shows. So you're not even doing that. What's the point? So there's no crowd popping for mediocre wrestlers. I'm okay. I'll pass. I'll watch real in-ring performers do in-ring stuff without the fans if I have to choose one or the other. That's the way I see it. Then I may get flack for it, but that's just my stance on it. I refuse. I'm not watching this year's WrestleMania for that.
As we kind of transition to a potential MLB season with no fans,
Yes.
Cory, you watched WrestleMania, I'm assuming.
Yep.
What was it like watching it with no fans? Like, kind of give us, do you have an idea of like what it could, I feel like the closest thing that I could say is I've seen a MLB game that had no fans. It was relatively recent. It was the Mets playing Baltimore during one of their protests, and there was nobody in the stadium, and it was one of the weirdest things to watch. And of course, now we might have that for half of a season, if not an entire season. So what was your impact, or what was your thoughts on the impact of having no fans, and did it impact the product, in the ring?
Wow, he said the word impact more than me or Jason has said in the 6 weeks or 7 weeks we've been back.
TNA Impact, there's another one you could watch.
Yeah, I remember I watched a little bit of Impact, not going to lie.
I'm sorry. It hasn't been terrible since the limited match I guess you could watch in the U.S.
It hasn't been terrible, yes.
That's a high standard some weeks.
Yeah.
Especially, when you have to watch Raw for 3 hours. Empty arena matches it's a very weird thing. I think that AEW has done it the right way, which I think, Felipe, you said you've watched a little bit in regards to that, where they've done something that's on and off, which is interesting, where they've had a couple of the idea is they put ordinance where you can only have, I guess, 10 people, there, and UFC is going to have to deal with this, in in 2 weeks when they somehow still decide to go on with their UFC 249 show. But they went and put a couple of babyface wrestlers on one side and then heel wrestlers on the other to at least have some sort of crowd noise and participation, which has been an interesting way of doing it. But the WWE has just decided to, after the first week of showing, empty seats, they went and did like just a view of just the ring, so you don't see the empty seats, which made it better.
Yeah.
But I think fans were prepared because for the last 2 weeks, Raw and SmackDown and NXT was doing it, so it wasn't as jarring. But the idea of having nobody there and being able to hear the crickets does take away from it. But I mean, one or two of the matches were really good. I mean, you had the NXT women's match between Charlotte and Rhea Ripley was a very good professional wrestling match. So I think if it's a really good match, it makes up for it. But overall, it's a hard experience to get over. And I think most people are giving a thumbs up or grading on a curve for WrestleMania because they know the situation that McMahon put himself in. I mean, not to get political in this by any stretch, but McMahon deciding to do this was ridiculous. And if anybody, we find out in a couple of days, tested positive for the coronavirus, I think he should be held personally responsible because this was stupid. I mean, is it one thing to be able to go and watch something and not be sitting in the house watching Netflix or whatever and going stir crazy? Right? It's a distraction. But still the other idea of, the idea of not these guys working, I still think is wrong. Much as I love AEW, I still think they're making a mistake, but it's entertainment and, it filled time.
I'm just now seeing a picture of The Fiend, and oh my God, he actually wears that in the ring.
Yeah.
If I was an 8-year-old kid, I would be pissing my pants every time his face showed up on the screen. That is something else. That is frightening. That is
I'm
real
sure the
frightening.
merchandise sales are through the roof right now with that demographic, because that's really what it boils down to. Cory, I just wanted to piggyback off of what you just mentioned about the empty seats in the arena, and if anybody gets infected, I mean, that's kind of what was. I was watching last Wednesday NXT and AEW before I went on with Matthew Whelan on his podcast for emergency status reasons, and I got depressed watching it because I'm watching Kenny Omega, and I forgot who he was facing last week, but I'm watching Kenny Omega trying to wrestle in an empty arena, risking his life, for better or for worse, I guess. I don't know how risky it is, because I have no idea when they recorded, but either way, long story short, I started worrying, like, okay, so when do we hear about these guys getting sick from this virus because they kept on and they getting in contact with other human beings? And I flipped over to NXT, and that was even worse because there's nobody out there except for the two combatants and the referee. And either way, you're lessening the blow by having less people in front of the camera, but at the same time, you're still increasing your chances of getting sick. So that was a major turnoff for me. That's another reason why I didn't want to watch this Wrestlemania, was because what's the point? I mean, it just didn't feel right for me. And I don't know if you felt the same way watching the last couple of weeks or so. I know you have to watch because you do a wrestling podcast, but you have that feeling in you that, man, I feel sorry for these guys and these gals for being up there.
Well, first of all, it was Kenny Omega versus Trent Beretta. I don't know why I remember that so fast, but
Thank you. Yeah.
And it was I thought it was a really good match. And just to sidestep for 1 second, one of the guys who, if you love the in-ring product, Sean, and this is a moniker of his, but Kenny Omega is a guy that if you want to try to get back into wrestling, he is more than likely, for at least on the North American side of wrestling, he is the best wrestler in the world. I know that was a moniker of the CM Punks and the Chris Jerichos, but believe me, I know Shane McMahon. Yeah, exactly. But Kenny Omega is one of those guys that every time he's out there, you know he's giving 100%. And one of those things that maybe you may want to watch to get yourself back into wrestling is a YouTube show called Being the Elite, which the Young Bucks have. It's like usually like somewhere between like 15 and like 25 minutes. It's a little goofy, but it can get you into storylines, different things. BTE, Being the Elite. But getting back to your question, Felipe, at first it was a little jarring, and that's one of the things that kind of got me when it came to the Orton Edge match on a separate issue when it comes to real life. I guess I've been able to separate it just with my, I guess, sports brain and wrestling brain, of just being able to go and say, this is here and this is what I'm watching. Like sometimes, like if I think like not to get too crazy off topic, but like at some point, if you're going to watch like a Mel Gibson movie, or if you're going to watch, a sporting event, you have to separate the things that, are you going to watch like an old Hulk Hogan match, realizing the guy's a scumbag because of the things he said about, things that we've heard him, tape stuff about, minorities and different things, and still enjoy the fact that, he had a great match against The Rock and, in the biggest match in mostly the history of the business against Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3, or Mel Gibson stuff, he said about Jews, or you could enjoy, the Lethal Weapon movies, or, different things. I mean, I know I'm going a little off here, but I mean,
well, it's different here because it just happened recently while the pandemic's going, and that's why I'm asking, like, right here, right now. I mean, like, the reason I couldn't stomach it anymore, which is pretty hypocritical, because the other week before Australia even shut down, I was watching Australia Football Rules, and I felt sorry for those players too, because if anything happens, these guys can get contaminated with this virus. But then I turn it off because finally we have a live sporting event on television that I'm watching, and I enjoyed that match, Australian Football League rules, and then then they went out of business because of the whole pandemic. But for wrestling, even though I was able easily to turn it off for the Australian Football League game, I just can't do it for wrestling for some reason. That was really the question. Because I just feel too sorry for these guys. Maybe it's because I'm more attached to these wrestlers than I am to the Australian football players. Maybe, I don't know.
I don't know. Like I said, I mean, I think it's just I'm able to mostly easily, after a while, just turn my brain off and just say, these guys have made a decision. I mean, because one of the things, I don't know, Sean, if you know or not, because I said you don't follow the stuff as closely as me and Felipe do. One of the things that was done, I don't know how much I believe it on the WWE end, but Tony Khan, who's the owner of the Jacksonville Jaguars and also the owner of AEW, went and told all of his wrestlers, anyone who does not feel comfortable wrestling during the pandemic, you will not be punished or lose your spot. No angles, that you're in currently, you'll be punished or anything. I don't know. Vince McMahon, who is a psycho, not a psychopath, but a sociopath, we'll put it that way. You're not going to lose your spot or anything, but we've passed things like with guys like Wade Barrett, he got hurt, then he came back and was like the guy never existed again. Yeah. Maybe I don't feel as bad due to the fact that these guys had a choice. And these guys have downside guarantees, and not like these guys aren't going to get, especially like in AEW where they're getting paid more, and these guys aren't getting paid if they don't show up right now. Maybe I don't feel, maybe I'm heartless, maybe a little bit. I've cried during Dirty Dancing, so Rudy, every time I watch it, it's tears flow down my street. I'm a little emotional to do, whatever. No, but you've heard way too much about me right now, but.
No,
but there's just the idea. What was that?
No, it's just like interesting you mentioned Rudy, because on a couple of Saturdays ago, me and the football guys, we were talking about football movies, right? This is what we got to do when there's no sports on. We're reaching for topics, and you miss me bashing Rudy in the football podcast for about 5 minutes or so. Oh, I hate Rudy. I hate Rudy. But
I thought it was overrated, but I didn't think it was terrible.
No, it's not terrible. It's just that like you just mentioned. Can you not separate? I can. I know Rudy would end up being a jailbird, and I think Matt Bushnell, my podcast partner, mentioned that he was a pedophile. And even the Notre Dame, his own teammates question the freedom that the studio took in Rudy's story as well. So that kind of, sorry, what?
So it's the factual parts of the fact that
the factual parts that. Yeah, and to this day, I still can't watch Rudy because the factual parts are too cognizant in me. So that's why I can't do it. But I just wanted to point out that we did talk about that movie where I bashed Rudy for about 5 minutes, and that felt really good because screw that guy and screw Notre Dame. Always. Go ahead.
All right, like I said, I'm not a Notre Dame fan, but the movie, did something for me. I love Rudy, but whatever. How many podcasts do you do? Jeez, I thought I was a podcaster. What the hell is going on?
No, Felipe gets around. He gets around in the podcast groups.
How many podcast diseases do you have over here, Felipe?
For sure. At the beginning of this, when we started, and I'm glad you mentioned the podcast because I wanted to mention why you're here, because we started this back in January, this podcast thing, and I've been podcasting on my own. Sean's a witness since maybe 2014 with my buddy Matt Bushnell for a website called xnsports.com. And then because when Bushnell went to live in Arizona, the time zone differences was too much for me to overcome sometimes, and likewise for him. So I started looking for a podcast partner, and then I started asking for, hey Sean, when are you available? And I asked other people, just so I can take advantage of the platform that I had with XN Sports to use my voice as a vehicle to speak my mind on these topics. But because how many of us get that privilege? Nowadays it seems to be easy, like anybody can do it, but I don't see everybody else with podcasts. It's just a few people that are actually.
We've got a lot of people.
Well, no, the ones that stand out are the ones who are passionate about it, right? That's all I'm saying. And no free plugs, no free hair plugs, Henry. I was gonna say, so I did a wrestling podcast at XN Sports, and I did this, I did that, and then I kind of stopped because it was the process was too hard on me. Like again, the cream rises to the top, and I guess I didn't have enough juice to keep going. I know you mentioned that you edit stuff, and for me, it's like I was doing more editing and less doing content, and that just kind of defeated the purpose. And then I hook up with these guys, and then I brought it up. Hey, well, how would you guys like to do a podcast for these, 100 groups that we have? We do have a football group, we do have a wrestling group, we do have a hockey group, and a pop culture group, and a food group, and so on and so forth. And luckily, my fellow admins were all gun-ho. Henry was all on it. Vince Mercandetti, who really spearheaded this project, was really for it. And we got the Zoom accounts that we needed, and we got the platforms that we needed, and we went on. So we've been on this for January. And to get back to your question, I insisted that I wanted to do 3 podcasts. The baseball one with Sean, a pop culture one with my friend Katie, and the wrestling podcast with Brett. Unfortunately, what ended up happening was it got a little bit too much for me, and I was getting dirty looks from my pregnant wife that maybe I have too much on my plate. Thank you, sir. And so I had to make a hard decision, and I had to whittle it down to one, and I chose Sean over everybody else. But baseball is my. No, you should be, but no, it really is because baseball is my. I found out that baseball was my primary passion, and that's why I'm here. But every once in a while, I mean, I am very opinionated. I will show up on the basketball podcast. I will show up on the football podcast as a guest. Okay, or whenever I need it. Like last week, Whelan, the God bless his soul, he wanted a partner because his regular podcast partner was sick. He's been going through some health issues, and I hope Johnny finally feels better, so I don't have to do it ever again because it's kind of awkward to talk about food when I don't even cook anymore.
Felipe's out there like, I'm really good at making chicken nuggets.
Now listen, I could do more than chicken nuggets, but I'll tell you what, it got so desperate for me that I started just sharing my computer screen and just searching the internet because Whelan had mentioned that he always wanted to eat a tarantula, so a fried tarantula. So I looked what tarantula looked like, and I also saw that there's hamburger tarantula. So the show kind of went to a screeching halt when I showed everybody on the podcast a picture of a tarantula burger, and that's when and Ryan Shiner, who's one of our more active members in these groups, he goes, I just noticed that half the people left the podcast. And I go, oh, you know what, Whelan, I think that's a good place to stop. We can't keep going.
Yeah, that's a good job.
That's the podcast version of Jumping the Shark is showing the tarantula burger. When you show a tarantula burger, it might be time to stop.
So Felipe, don't take this. I'm saying this, of course, very kindly. So you were a podcast whore. Now you're just a podcast slut. That's how we're gonna.
Oh yeah, man, I'm all about it. I mean, before that, I was into writing, and then I realized that I've been on what do you call it, on what I like to describe as a writer's block era of my writing, which this writer's block has now lasted for about maybe. God, I don't even remember the last article I wrote for anybody at this point. But in lieu of writing articles, baseball articles, football articles, whatever you have, I do this now with you guys. And then you, sir, Cory, you've done over 200 of these wrestling podcasts for a long time. And the reason that you're here is because you helped us, and I do appreciate it. You helped get our podcast onto Stitcher, onto Spotify, onto iTunes. Like what seems to be basic for you, like the 10 of us behind the scenes, couldn't figure out how to get on those platforms for the longest time. And it was always a dream of mine to be on Spotify and to be on Stitcher because I use those platforms a lot. So we have you to thank for getting that ball rolling. And with that being said, I mean, you've done 200 of these and you obviously know your way around this. Any advice you have for us within our group, within the podcast group, or even anybody who's listening, who's thinking about starting one and doesn't know where to start or doesn't know how to go about it? Any advice you have for these people that you might have to share with us today?
And just to piggyback real fast so you can wrap up both questions, what do you want to see in a fantasy baseball podcast? What would you like to see most?
Yeah.
Well, I guess in a fantasy baseball podcast, I guess one thing that, because I'm in an NL only, I'm in way too many. I think I'm in 4 leagues. If baseball ever starts,
You're a fantasy whore, huh?
I am a huge fantasy whore that they just come and they say, here, just take the blood, just go and just squirt it anywhere you need. I'm not trying to get you guys in trouble here. My podcast has an explicit tag, so we talk about wrestling. Why would they need one? But me and Jason, we just can't help ourselves. But
right.
I would like, a fantasy that's more league specific, I guess. I'm in an NL only league, and when you listen to a lot of podcasts, they feel like they're just some of them are just too broad, I guess, sometimes in nature. Like maybe even if it was just like in preseason wise, maybe more episodes that weren't just, I'm going to go and tell you who the 20 best first basemen are in this format. Maybe, just sometimes a little bit more specific, breaking down certain things. I guess that would be something that'd be interesting. And also, I think it'd be interesting in having a podcast when it comes to it, a little bit more on why you're picking up guys, not just, when it comes to leagues, not just this guy's available. I picked up this guy, and not the idea of, in 95% of leagues, people aren't being dropped, every 3 seconds. If you listen to all of these big, I'm not going to go and publicize other ones, but I'm sure leagues this podcast I'm talking about, the super successful ones, they're usually talking about 12-team leagues where all of these guys are available on the free agency wire. Most leagues when you're playing, not everybody's playing in these super shallow leagues. I mean,
Yeah.
I know that's what makes all of these leagues. Maybe the more people, the beginner leagues are in maybe like 10 and 12 teams leagues, but there are people like I'm in a 16-team league, I'm in a 12-team NL only.
Oh, that's
I'm
tough.
in a
That's
14,
tough.
I'm in a 14-team league with that's categories plus weekly on base. I mean, I'm in a daily league, which is a nightmare. I don't want to go and deal with that because I don't want to deal with it. But I mean, I just think maybe even if you're doing a podcast that's just sometimes you have episodes that are dealing with more league specific problems. I mean.
Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I feel like that's something that was one of the big reasons why I've liked our little bit that we've done with the build a fantasy lineup out of these teams, is especially in the first few that we did were like the terrible teams and kind of the pretenders out west, and I love the terrible teams when we did Baltimore, Seattle, because it was fun because we did get to talk about a lot of guys that in a league only format, like guys like Austin Hayes, Daniel Vogelbach, those are going to be guys that you need in an AL only. I'm telling you, they are.
Seattle?
Who, Vogelbach?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
He's going to be their DH with Evan White getting his Scott Kingery contract extension. I'm just scrolling through Facebook here, and I believe this is almost our sign of we're coming up on the hour mark here, but it's the Mets broadcasting Johan Santana's no-hitter. And we talked about baseball. We talked about wrestling. There's a comment in here made by a Chris Benoit on a baseball video. I'm taking that as a sign that we have a wrestling and a baseball crossover on Facebook. So any last words for you, Cory?
I guess just the idea of if there, like I said earlier, if you ever have like wrestling and if you're a lapsed fan, there's always something out there. If you look, I mean, I'm not saying you have to go out there and search just to find something you like, but I think there is something out there for everyone. Like AEW is out there. You've got.
I plan on watching it tomorrow. Now that you've told me about it, I'm going to try and watch it.
You got AEW, you got NXT, you got New Japan Pro Wrestling, you've got Ring of Honor. If you're desperate, you've got Impact. I'm saying that
if you're desperate.
I mean, you've got MLW, which is another company that's on BN Sports. If you're a soccer fan, you know what that is. My partner loves soccer. I don't get it, but hey, other people like rugby and different things and whatever you liked over there. Australian football, I guess that was
what Felipe said.
But if you like different things, there are things that there you'll be able to find something. It is incredibly goofy. It's something that you usually liked when you were a kid. Usually when you found out that there was the opposite sex, you decided that it didn't exist anymore. You know what? Especially during the quarantine, there's only so much time you can spend with your significant other watching, Netflix and, whatever that Tiger King thing is.
Yeah. I recommend it. Go watch it. It's something else.
and apparently this guy, Joe, what is this guy's name?
Joe Exotic.
He actually has a connection to wrestling, apparently. A guy named Tim Storm on NWA Power, which is a show that's on YouTube. There's so much goddamn wrestling on it. You can find something. A guy named Tim Storm actually apparently either wrestled him or did something with involvement with him with NWA Power, which, like I said, is another one which is on YouTube, which they're doing pretty well right now. I think they actually aired an episode where they did some sort of thing showing where Joe Exotic was there. So, I mean, everyone is trying to get in on the Joe Exotic or Tiger King, bandwagon. Me personally, it's not my type of thing, but maybe I'll try it. But I haven't gotten there yet. I'm still whoring myself out on
wrestling. And you, Felipe, any last words before we leave our viewers today?
I think Felipe got.
I'm going to say you forgot to mention Lucha Ground. Oh, great.
If you want to catch up on Lucha Underground, I think the first 2 seasons are on Netflix and at least on Cablevision, the Bronx. After 4 years after it's off the air, we now have the El Rey network. So I guess they're showing replays. But the one thing I did want to say before you let me go, once again, you can check out the Workshoot Wrestling podcast on iTunes and everywhere else. And we're on Anchor FM just like you guys. But also, I work on another podcast. I hope you don't mind me plugging this, but
Go for it.
called You Don't Know Jackie, which is our comedy podcast, which is something different to say the least. If you enjoy listening to me get berated and made to look like a fool, which I think I did for like the last hour, you'll enjoy that. Once again, that's You Don't Know Jackie. Comes out every Wednesday. We'll be most likely moving them to Anchor FM as well, because who wants to spend $12 a month on Buzz, whatever that website we're on now. But and I would say that anyone who wants to go the easy way of doing a podcast, Anchor FM is the way to do it. It's a free site, and it's a very easy to go and start. And if you have one you're paying, there's a thing on there on Anchor FM to just switch. So I've spoken and I've given them way too much publicity.
Hey, it was when we uploaded our episode last week, I was shocked to see how great it was. So shameless plug to Anchor FM. But Felipe, I believe, is having some slight connection issues. He just messaged me. So can you hear us, Felipe?
I can hear you guys. I just don't know if you guys can hear me.
Oh yeah, we can hear you. Any last words?
No, Cory, thank you so much for being on this episode and for the wrestling knowledge and for the being a good sport about converging it into some weird fantasy baseball amalgamation. I do appreciate that. Appreciate everything you've done for our podcast. Henry wants me to make sure that I also plug the Pod Jobbers podcast, which I've been doing throughout the show. But one more time, I think they have a show this Thursday night. Also, there's the food one on the Food Life Network. Oh, God.
Food Life Network.
But no,
we're not there yet. We have a lot of groups, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, well, it's a network. It's just not called a network. But no, I do appreciate you hopping on and talking some wrestling, some baseball, some fantasy booking. It's been a fun one today. It gives me
hope.
No, not hope. Just something different to focus on. I mean, it's been like I said. Even though Sean and I we come up with whatever just to keep ourselves kind of relevant. It was kind of nice to just not to be so fantasy baseball focused this week.
Yeah, it was fun to change gears. That's how I viewed it.
Thank you. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say here as well. So, but again, we cannot thank you enough for. I think I heard Sean talk about how when we got into Spotify and Stitcher. I don't know about Sean. I couldn't hear him, but I was jumping for joy like I just won the Super Bowl.
Yeah, it's pretty cool to see it on Spotify and iTunes as well. Yes. I agree.
Yeah, I'm listening to my Bad Religion music, and then and I listen to myself just for practicing purposes, or Vince's podcast, or the wrestling. Well, no, the wrestling podcast is not there yet, but the football podcast. That one, I know that one's in there. I've been catching up on those podcasts by Stitcher and Spotify, so it's been a godsend. And we have you to thank for giving us that opportunity. So thank you so much for that.
And open invitation. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Cory. Go ahead.
Open invitation whenever you guys want to come on the Workshoot Wrestling podcast and promote. As long as Henry doesn't want to come on,
Henry's not allowed.
I'm still trying to go, clear up some, tax information, but no, I'm kidding. But if either of you guys ever want to come on and have a little fun, more than happy to have you on. And thanks a lot for dealing with my silliness for the last hour or so.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much. And if you are listening to this on purely audio, be sure to come join us over at Baseball Life and our Assorted Life podcast and groups on Facebook. We talk about everything from baseball to football to wrestling to food. You're good to go, Felipe?
I'm good to go. I'm ready to have my dinner.
So and we'll see you guys all next week. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a good night, guys.